It's like follow the leader. Everybody does what the Hulkster does. It's like truth, justice, and the Hulk Hogan way.
Right.
And hope to
The death of Hulk Hogan on July 24th, 2025, sent shockwaves through the wrestling world, leaving fans and fellow wrestlers alike reeling in disbelief. For decades, Hogan had stood as the face of professional wrestling, the larger-than-life figure who carried the business from smoky arenas into mainstream pop culture. He was more than a performer. He was a cultural icon, a man who embodied the superhero archetype in flesh and blood, with his yellow and red attire, booming charisma, and unmatched presence. To countless fans, he seemed untouchable, the type of figure who could never truly fall. Yet when the news broke that Hogan had passed away at his home in Clearwater, Florida, it felt like an era had collapsed overnight. The initial reports were straightforward. According to police and hospital officials, Hogan went into cardiac arrest on the morning of July 24th. Emergency responders rushed him to Morton Plant Hospital, but despite their efforts, he was pronounced dead at 11:17 a.m. The statement was clear. No signs of foul play, no unusual circumstances, simply the tragic passing of a 71-year-old man whose body had borne the weight of decades in one of the most punishing industries on Earth. On the surface, it seemed like a sad but natural end. Yet for Hogan's daughter, Brooke, the story didn't align with what she knew. And within weeks, she began releasing documents, statements, and evidence that suggested her father's death was far more complicated. Brooke's revelations turned what had begun as a public outpouring of grief into a storm of suspicion and debate. She argued that her father's passing wasn't simply the result of age or natural decline, but the culmination of years of exploitation, medical negligence, and corporate greed. The picture she painted was dark, unsettling, and raised the question of whether Hulk Hogan's death had truly been inevitable, or whether it had been accelerated by forces that saw him less as a human being and more as a commodity to be profited from. At the center of her claims was a lawsuit Hogan himself had filed years earlier, a $50 million case against the Laser Spine Institute, a medical group that had performed multiple surgeries on him between 2009 and 2010. Hogan had undergone 6 separate procedures in less than 2 years, all aimed at addressing his debilitating spinal issues. But according to the lawsuit, these operations weren't just ineffective. They were unnecessary, allegedly sold to him through scare tactics that dissuaded him from pursuing more traditional treatments like spinal fusion surgery. Brooke leaked court documents and filings that described how her father had been steered into risky, experimental procedures because they were lucrative for the Institute. For Hogan, the consequences were catastrophic. Instead of healing, his back deteriorated further, leaving him in constant agony and robbing him of his physical strength, mobility, and career opportunities. By the time he reached his 60s, Hogan was almost unrecognizable compared to the hero fans remembered. Once billed at 6'7", spinal compression had reduced his height by nearly 3 inches. His famous arms, once dubbed the 24-inch pythons, had lost much of their mass. His bronzed, camera-ready image faded, replaced by a man who struggled with the simplest daily tasks. In interviews, he admitted that even brushing his teeth could be a challenge, because he couldn't push himself back up afterward. Behind the bravado of the Hulkster was a man living in near-constant pain, the product of not just a punishing career, but, according to the documents Brooke shared, years of questionable medical decisions. The lawsuit revealed just how high the stakes were. Hogan estimated damages of over $50 million, claiming that the Institute's choices had permanently damaged his health and robbed him of career-defining opportunities. Chief among these was the dream of a WrestleMania showdown with John Cena, a generational passing of the torch moment that fans had clamored for. Hogan admitted publicly that his body was too broken for such a match, and Brooke argued that the blame lay not with time or nature, but with a medical system that had exploited him for profit. Though the lawsuit was eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, Brooke maintained that the settlement money could never undo the damage. By the time her father received proper spinal fusion surgery, it was too late. The chance for a final grand farewell was gone. But Brooke's disclosures did not stop at surgical malpractice. She revealed that her father had also been overprescribed powerful and dangerous medications in ways that bordered on reckless. Chief among them was fentanyl, an opioid so potent that even small doses have been linked to fatal overdoses across the country. Hogan himself had admitted in earlier interviews that he hadn't even realized how much of the drug he had been given until he nearly overdosed. The documents Brooke released showed shocking details. Fentanyl patches and pills prescribed in quantities that stunned pharmacists, a level of dosage that could easily have ended his life years before his actual passing. For Brooke, this was not an accident, but part of a larger system that profited from keeping her father dependent, cycling him through prescriptions and procedures without ever truly helping him heal. This narrative grew darker when Brooke began speaking about the inner circle that surrounded Hogan in his final years. To the public, friends and colleagues like Jimmy Hart and Eric Bischoff painted pictures of optimism. They spoke about karaoke nights, recovery, and the Hulkster's phenomenal condition. But according to Brooke, these reassurances were not hopeful exaggerations. They were deliberate deceptions meant to preserve the image of Hulk Hogan the brand, even as Terry Bollea, the man, was breaking down. In her view, protecting the illusion of health was less about privacy and more about maintaining business interests tied to his name. The result, she claimed, was that her father was denied dignity in his last years, forced to suffer in silence while the world was told he was thriving. Family estrangement only deepened the tragedy. Brooke had been publicly distant from her father for years, citing manipulation and abuse. Yet when she released her revelations, she admitted that her distance carried its own guilt. In her own words, she acknowledged that by cutting ties, by choosing silence, and by supporting lawsuits and financial battles, she had indirectly fed into the machinery that exploited him. It was not an admission of direct responsibility, but it was a haunting recognition that even within his family, Hogan had been surrounded by conflict and isolation. Her brother Nick's testimony added another dimension. Nick had been present during Hogan's final months, especially after major spinal surgery in May 2025. According to him, the decline was far worse than the public ever knew. He described feeding tubes, breathing struggles, and vocal cord damage that left Hogan almost unrecognizable from the figure fans imagined. Yet none of this was revealed to the public, hidden behind a wall of reassurances and upbeat statements. Brooke insisted that this wasn't merely a family's attempt to shield their loved one's suffering, but an orchestrated cover-up that served business and branding interests rather than truth. The official death report, later leaked by Brooke, listed a litany of conditions: renal failure, fluid overload, severe COPD, and finally, cardiac arrest. These weren't sudden, mysterious afflictions, but long-developing medical issues that had been quietly hidden. To Brooke, the concealment was part of the betrayal. Hogan's decline wasn't faced openly, wasn't confronted with honesty, but instead hidden until it culminated in his death. She described it as death by 1,000 cuts, each failed surgery, each overprescribed drug, each deception and manipulation pushing her father closer to the grave. The most jarring part of Brooke's disclosures was her own role in the story. She admitted, with raw honesty, that she too had played into the system she now condemned. By supporting lawsuits, by fueling financial battles, by keeping her distance when her father needed her, She believed she had indirectly contributed to the forces that wore him down. Her confession blurred the line between victim and participant. Was she exposing the truth as a grieving daughter determined to honor her father's memory? Or was she trying to absolve herself of guilt by implicating others? That question divided fans and observers, leaving Hogan's legacy clouded not just by betrayal from outsiders, but by the complexity of his own family ties. Despite the bitterness of these revelations, the world's response to Hogan's death was still immense. Tributes poured in from wrestlers, celebrities, athletes, and politicians. Fans filled arenas and online spaces with memories of the man who told them to train, say their prayers, and take their vitamins. His image as the ultimate babyface hero, the man who body-slammed giants